Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy. We are a pay and reward consultancy supporting organisations of all sizes and sectors to take a fair and equitable approach to pay, communicated clearly and honestly to employees. In this podcast, we invite experts to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the world of HR, culture and leadership. We're keen to explore how we can all work to overcome and navigate these challenges. So, tune in to explore how you could create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to.
Welcome to another episode of A Case of the Mondays. I'm Ramiz Kaleem, your host, and in today's episode, we're discussing the impact of employee referral programs on diversity. Imagine you're a hiring manager or recruitment manager, and one of your star employees just recommended their friend for a vacancy. Now that sounds great because the candidate has come from a trusted source, but it seems that this may not be the best approach when it comes to building a diverse and inclusive workforce. My guest today is Ruth Thomas, who is Chief Evangelist, VP Integrated Marketing at PayScale. Ruth is a seasoned compensation professional and a pioneer in the use of SaaS technology to transform traditional approaches to reward and drive fair pay. Ruth founded Cura Compensation in 2010 and led the introduction of the HR tech category, Equality Tech, by bringing to market one of the first pay equity analytics solutions aiming to drive fair pay. Ruth is a leading voice in the campaign for pay equity and worked with global organizations using technology to help drive fair and transparent pay. Welcome to the podcast, Ruth.
Welcome. Hello, Ramiz. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. We first met many years ago when I was at Auto Trader, and you had just co-founded Cura, and I remember we had a demo of the product, which we all really liked, and it was around managing annual pay and the performance process. And I think so you've been focusing on sort of the tech side over the next few years, and I've moved on to 3R Strategy. I didn't imagine at the time that I would be inviting you as a guest to discuss employee referral programs. And so I think the first thing I'm interested to find out is how you became interested in this topic, because all of us that work in HR know about employee referral programs, but thinking about this from a diversity perspective is not really something that I think is often discussed. So how did you become aware of this, and how did you get involved in it?
Well, first of all, I'd say you've got a good memory, Ramiz, thinking that long ago to when you were Auto Trader. But to answer your question, how did I first become aware of this issue? And it was really through the work that I have done on pay equity analysis. So I've focused probably for the last 5 years, really since the introduction of the gender pay gap reporting legislation in the UK, on helping organisations to address pay gaps, and we created technology which we brought to market to help them do that. And working with organisations, first of all, helping them to diagnose their pay gaps, but also trying to understand the root causes of those pay gaps. The ethnicity pay gap, or the race and ethnicity pay gap, is an interesting one because it does have some very subtle differences from root causes of the gender pay gap, and one of them was the lack of network that people from different ethnicity groups can have. And that kind of got me thinking to, okay, well, if you have a network, it's hard for you to get referred into an organization, and then really start thinking about, well, what part do employee referral programs have, and can they have an impact on diversity? And I think that's really kind of the way I got into this topic.
Okay. And so a lot of us that think about employee referral programs see the positive side of this. So from an HR perspective, you might see that you are saving time in interviewing. So possibly, instead of 3 you might have 2 interviews because it's come from a trusted source, for example, or it might save you on recruitment costs because you're not having to go out to agencies to source candidates. I mean, as a business owner, again, I think, one of the best ways of getting candidates through is through existing employees because, again, I often think when we're recruiting, it's not just about people having the right skills, it's about the right values and the attitudes. And that there's a good chance that if somebody's recommending someone, that they're going to have the right values. So we understand the positives. What would you say are some of the drawbacks or things to look out for when we're implementing employee referral programs?
Well, I'd say, you're absolutely right. Referral programs are actually becoming more popular in the current workforce landscape. It's quite a frustrating hiring market out there. If you're out there trying to hire employees, you're probably feeling this. Post the Great Resignation, with skills shortages and pressure to control costs, finding the right candidate is quite a hard task. And what we're hearing from many organisations is that they're being overwhelmed by the number of applications that they're receiving. Some of that potentially, there's some speculation whether that's being driven by the AI-enabled talent
Mm.
acquisition systems that are very popular. I mean, talent acquisitions systems were one of the first kind of use cases for AI, and whether that's causing some of the problems. So if you're a recruiter, and we see it at PayScale. I mean, I talk to our talent acquisition team here. We are being overwhelmed with applications at the moment, particularly because there's been a few layoffs in the HR tech sector recently as well. So there's a lot of people out there. So referral programs, are at face value seem to be a great solution. I think they are a great solution for some of the reasons that you stated. They it's more cost effective. As you say, you're probably going to get people who are going to reflect the values of the employees that you already have within the organization. We see from some of the data that we have, that referred employees are generally have a high level of engagement. So there are lots of reasons for referral programs happening, and we do see like rates on the increase, and organizations paying referral bonuses is increasing. There is a darker side to it from the DE&E perspective, and stating the obvious, and that's because white people, and white men in particular, historically have been the majority group in most organizations. And in our personal and professional lives, our networks tend to be composed of people that look like us. And I know that's not the case for everybody, but in that environment, you do end up with a somewhat self-perpetuating cycle of the fact that your employees, if you have a majority white workforce, for example, are more likely to refer white candidates from their personal networks. I do think that's changing to some degree, because if I think back to when pre-LinkedIn being so prevalent, all of us using LinkedIn, our networks have got so much larger now.
Mm.
So previously, you were probably referring from your professional network or your personal network, but now our professional networks have expanded and our reach has expanded significantly because of LinkedIn. I mean, I see posts all the time where um, people are offering jobs in their organization, knowing that people from other organizations have recently been laid off. So LinkedIn is a great enabler in terms of extending your professional work, and the chances therefore of a more extended network is having a more diverse network.
And I was reading, so there's some research that I know PayScale have published around this, and I was reading some of this, and I saw that it also breaks down the referral schemes into the type of referrals. So whether it's a friend or a family referral, if it's a professional contact. Have you seen some differences in those different types of referrals in organizations? And is one type of referral preferable to another?
Well, I think the closer the connection is normally, deemed by the organisation to have better impact. So a better chance of success of the candidate, because that's kind of all the reasons we've spoken about. You know that person, you know their work, you know their values, and so you think they're going to be a good fit. So if you're referring someone that's, a close contact or a business contact, then those tend to be more successful. I'm trying to think of any other differences that I can remember off the top of my head. I can't think of any right at the moment. I mean, there was some interesting data from the study, from a D&I lens. We saw that referral programs benefited white men more than any other demographic group. So white women were 12% less likely than men of colour, and men of colour 26% less likely, and women of colour 35% less likely to receive job referrals than their white male counterparts. So that was kind of looking at the population where we asked 53,000 people, had you received a referral into your current role? And then we looked at the demographic analysis of that population. We were able to see those trends.
Okay. Well, I mean, when you mentioned the stat around white men and having the most referrals, I guess it does feel, um, it's not unexpected. So it does feel like it makes sense because that's the largest population in a lot of organizations, and so. But I can also then see that if you are trying to create a more diverse and inclusive workforce, that this isn't going to help because that your biggest population is recommending um, more from that population. So, what would you recommend organizations do? What sort of checks would you recommend they have in place? What sort of um, changes that they should look at in their employee referral scheme to try and manage that bias which already exists in the organization, but this is going to, I guess, increase it?
Yeah. Well, as with any kind of drivers of the gender pay gap, I always say just look at the data, and you can run some very simple analysis to look at just counting the numbers. So the simplest way from a referral lens is look at the diversity of your job applicants to your organization, and then look at the diversity of your referred candidates, and is there a gap? And then whether you will be able to see immediately your referral program is potentially has a higher percentage of non-diverse candidates that are coming into the organization. I mean, ideally the best way to do this and to really look at the impact of diversity through your whole talent acquisition process is to break down the various stages of that process and just count the numbers. So count the number of applicants if you're putting a job ad out, count the number of people that get selected for a first stage interview, make it to a second stage interview, who get recruited, who then stay with the organization, and looking at that funnel in terms of how people make their journey into the organization and seeing who drops out where. I mean, it's an interesting analysis for many reasons, because it may also flag other issues that you might have in your talent acquisition pipeline, that there may be some ideal candidates that for some reason have certain skills that just aren't making it through the pipeline. Hot topic at the moment is about degree requirements, and organizations potentially dropping degree requirements. That can be a key reason when you can lose applicants through the process because they're screened out, because not having the right qualifications. So just basically doing the numbers, just count by gender, by diversity, by any other protected category group that you're actively monitoring or you have the data for at those different points along the talent pipeline.
Okay. So a lot of work for the HR team to, because I think there's a lot of data that's available around exit interviews, for example. So do you think that that's the sort of thing that should be um, linked to this in any way, or should we be looking at employee referral programs in isolation? And the reason I ask that, because if you talked about looking at the ethnicity pay gap, and we know that one of the main reasons, or probably the main reason, that the ethnicity pay gap exists, and same with gender pay gap, is the lack of representation at senior levels. And
Mm.
so, if your CEO, your exec team are all white, then and they're on salaries that are 20% more than your graduates, then that's going to create a big gap.
Mhm.
And so, when you look at employee referral programs, you will have your minority groups recommending candidates. And have you seen any data, if you know that when they make referrals, that people are joining at a similar sort of level, whereas when you get referrals from your white male employees, that you might potentially be getting senior manager role referrals? And is that something that comes into it, which obviously is going to increase the gap?
Yeah, we didn't look at levels in that research, I don't believe, but we did look at pay and the impact on pay because pay scale is all about pay, the clues in
Yeah.
the name. Um, and we did see through that 2018 study that a woman hired through a referral program got on average, this is in US dollars, 3,700 increase in pay from her current pay, but a man hired through a referral program got double that. So you could see that pay gap, gender pay gap, um, even in the the job through the job referral program. And we know that that's a problem. That's the reason why we have pay transparency policies coming in and legislation in the US, and then obviously salary history bands as well, becoming more popular, and likely to be bundled into the EU pay transparency directive. But basically trying to remove those gaps on hire. So we did see that in our study when we looked at referral programs, and it definitely had an impact on pay.
Because the other thing I remember seeing, which I thought was really interesting, was the the research talked about an average pay increase for people that came through referrals versus the rest of the employees. And from what I remember, I think it said that people that came through family referrals actually were receiving lower pay
Yes.
increases than the average employee, which I thought was really interesting. And I mean, is that something you dug deeper into to understand why that was the
No,
case?
I don't think we broke that down in the report, because we didn't really have any kind of data to substantiate that, or like it wasn't a trend that had been observed elsewhere. I mean, you could potentially speculate that if you're referring a friend because they do a job at another
Hmm.
organization, you maybe don't know them in the professional sense, and
Yeah.
so therefore them coming in, they may not have been potentially the right level for that job. They may have been, you're less likely to know the professional specifics of that individual if they're a friend or family member. It depends. You're probably thinking, oh well, I have a friend, they're working at this marketing company, they do that, sounds like they do the same job. Hey, did you know we have this here? So that
Hmm.
could be an impact in the fact that the person you're referring might not have been the right level. That's what I would speculate about that data, but we didn't have any evidence to back that up.
Okay. And you mentioned technology earlier and the technology sector, and the fact that there has been a lot of talk about referrals in the technology sector. But again, in the pay scale research, there was a table by sector, and I think technology was somewhere in the middle. So it wasn't like one of the sectors where there was a lot of referrals taking place. And in fact, I think the sector with the most referrals was the construction sector, and um, then the non-profit was in there. And
Yeah,
I think the
construction,
non-profit to
energy,
me,
and yeah,
and the
yeah,
non-profit
construction,
makes
energy,
sense.
utilities, and non-profit. Yeah.
Do you know why construction would be up there, or
Because it tends to be more casual labor in the sense that you've got people who've worked together on teams on other construction projects, and so
okay.
people will come like with their team, or they've worked somewhere else, so that you quite often have highly mobile workforces in that sector, in the kind of like traditional construction sector. So I think that's why you see kind of people who have worked together before on teams, and then they move to a new project, which is why potentially you see a higher referral level in there. Energy and utilities came second. I'm just looking at the stats on that. As you say, technology was in the middle. Tech companies have been scrutinised for relying on personal connections and referrals in hiring, but as you say, they fell in the middle of the pack when we look at the industry breakdown.
Okay. I mean, I saw that the non-profit was in there, which again I think makes sense because they're trying to minimize their recruitment costs, and so encouraging employees to refer candidates. But going back to the possible negative impact of this referral, how do you think organizations can incentivize employees to recommend or refer candidates from underrepresented underrepresented groups? And
Yeah.
is it, for example, would it be would it be illegal to start offering different referral payments based on what sort of candidates you're referring?
Well, the legality one I'll come to depends where you are, because there are laws in certain jurisdictions against positive discrimination. But organisations are definitely doing that. But I'd start with awareness. So, and you can't do that in isolation. Like we've seen frequently with organisations that try and introduce the DE&I tactic, if they're introduced in isolation, they have less chance of success. So you need to have kind of a culture of where people recognize what DE and I and B, whatever your acronym of choice is, and then also understand that as an organization why you believe it's important. And you have to have that kind of culture in place first, then raising awareness amongst your employees of your diversity statistics. So many organizations are publishing reports now. We do that here at PayScale, for example. We share our diversity data. We've just done a deeper level of analysis into that, and we're going to be sharing that with all our employees soon. So making them aware of what the issue is, because I think you and I have both discussed this, is quite often it's something you just don't think about being a problem. It's one of those kind of hidden gems or hidden problems that unless you actually think about it from the lens of diversity, you probably wouldn't realize that you had a problem. And that's like so many aspects of the talent management life cycle. So we are seeing organizations definitely incentivize, raising awareness amongst employees that we want to increase the number of diverse candidates in our workforce, and we would like you to refer diverse candidates to us. And we have seen there are schemes, particularly in the US, where employers are offering a higher level of referral bonus for a diverse candidate than for a non-diverse candidate. So it does exist.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be mixed opinions about that one.
Mm-hmm.
But when you say that there are organizations doing these sort of things, are you aware of any examples of organizations, either that you've worked with or you've heard of, that have successfully balanced the need for having a good employee referral program with also focusing on their diversity initiatives?
Well, I think it's definitely organizations that have had a wholesale commitment to D&I across the board, and every HR tactic or initiative they look at, they have a diversity lens to that, or diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to that. That's where it's success. I think this awareness around the problem with referrals, it isn't new. I mean, we wrote that report back in 2018, but I think it's a more recent tactic that we've seen with employers taking positive action to try and remedy the lack of balance in the referral program candidates coming through organisations, and probably many people aren't even measuring it. So I think it's a more recent tactic that we're seeing, and it kind of goes hand in hand with other tactics around your talent acquisition process, like looking at where do you typically go to advertise for talent? Are you using more diverse networks? So that's something that we've had a positive intent to do at PayScale in the last 12 months from with our HR function. We recognised that we needed to improve diversity in the organisation, and so we were using talent sourcing routes that were particularly for recruiting diverse candidates. And so that, that's a tactic again. I think you need to bring all of these facets together to be able to make sure that you're making improvements. Otherwise, you can do one, but then if that may be the success of that one tactic may be hindered by something else you're doing somewhere else. So I think you need to look again holistically at that talent funnel and how people are coming into your organization. I mean, we've seen work around if you're an organization that does job advertisements, it's thinking about the language that you use in the job advertisements. It's thinking about the images you use in the job advertisements. All of that impacts the type of person that may apply to your role. So we've seen a lot of organizations in the UK over the last sort of 4 to 5 years changing their approach to that. And anti-bias language is now becoming pretty much a standard feature of job description technology, seeking to address the whole, like, just how you describe a job and the responsibilities and the requirements to make sure that you're not biasing against any group of people in terms of what you're requiring from them.
Yeah, and I guess it also is very much highlighted in the EU directive when they talk about a lot of these things, and they keep talking about being objective and gender neutral, and that's the sort of thing that will have to be incorporated into job titles and job descriptions and all of these different things.
Yeah.
The You mentioned earlier, and I know this is maybe slightly off topic, but you said you talked about DE and I, and you said whatever your acronym of choice is, and I think we know that what probably prompted that, which is the recent change to the SHRM, which is sort of the equivalent of the CIPD in the US. They removed the E from DE and I, and they are just calling it D and I. So, what is your view? And I think I saw you post something about this. So, yeah, interested to hear your thoughts around this change that they've made to exclude equity from their acronym.
Yeah, a lot of chatter, obviously, last week after that announcement from the Society for Human Resource Management, which is the professional body, and it's also seen as the governing body for HR in the US. I work a lot in the US, so I've done work with them, and as you rightly say, they announced they were removing the E for equity from their DE&I acronym, and they've grouped equity under the I, inclusion. So they're umbrellaing it under inclusion. So they are now just focusing on inclusion and diversity, but it caused quite a lot of backlash, obviously. And if you're on LinkedIn, you would potentially have seen some of that. From their perspective, that they were looking at it from a US perspective because there is a lot of societal backlash happening and increasing polarization in the US at the moment around the whole topic of DE and I. We don't have that same level of polarization, I think, here in the UK, and particularly we're in an election year. We're obviously with the events that happened last week as well, with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Political feelings are very high. Now, Shrum will say it wasn't for political reasons, but they're saying that they wanted to remove the equity from the acronym because they were afraid that companies were walking back from their DE&I initiatives, and they didn't want that working on equity to be the reason that diversity programs fell down. But I wholly disagree with that approach, because for me, equity is the key to making change happen. And for equity, and there are lots of different. The problem is there are lots of different definitions of equity. If I asked you to describe it, and then I asked three other people to describe it, we'd probably all say something different. But it's really about giving people what they need to address the barriers that they face. So it's different than equality, where equality is you kind of give everybody the same opportunity. With equity, you're focusing on giving groups that need additional support to address barriers that they face more opportunity in order to make things fair. And so that's what we do when we analyse pay equity gaps. We look at root causes. We say, who are the disadvantaged groups? What do we have to do, to try and remedy that? So I find it very hard to take that. It's a fundamental principle of the sort of the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, if you use that as well in your acronym. But it's caused huge backlash. Be interesting to see how it plays out. Lots of SHRM members in the US cancelling their membership.
Oh, really?
And definitely. And it's probably just gonna, in a way, it's fueled discussions in what is already quite a heightened political environment in the US. And I know, I don't know whether your listeners are mainly in the UK, but maybe you are an employer with employees in the US. I do think we're starting to look at it as well as how we can facilitate meaningful political discussions in the workplace over the next few months as we run up to the US election, because it is becoming quite polarized.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading about how um, a lot of people are reluctant to discuss anything political because they just fear that they're going to get a backlash if they share their opinion,
Yeah,
particularly if they share the opinion about one particular party. And so, uh, yeah, I can imagine there was, there is a lot of polarization, but this issue around, because you mentioned that people have different definitions around equity, and for example, to me, it's around, like you said, uh, equal opportunities and looking at our biases. I don't, for example, think that we should be aiming for a zero ethnicity pay gap because it's not really telling us anything. It's an average of
mhm,
two different populations. And you can have a zero ethnicity pay gap, but a lot of pay inequity because people are being paid unfairly, but you're just hiring senior people to get rid of that gap.
yeah,
So I think it's it's hopefully that's the sort of thing that they were thinking about, that not to focus on these equity numbers, but hopefully there is still a drive to, because otherwise, I always think that um I think I maybe said that when you post, I have no desire to be included if there is no
mm,
equity. Then I remember there was have you read this book called by Liz and Molly? It was on diversity. I'm trying to remember the name, but they talked about this concept of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and um, it was around diversity was having a seat at the table, inclusion is having a voice, and belonging is having that voice be heard. And it
mhm,
was the same point of people don't really want to have a seat at the table if they're not going to be heard or they're not going to be treated equitably.
yeah,
So I think that's where a lot of people are coming from with this rage over the
yeah,
taking out of the E.
yeah. I mean, I think we know that certain groups of employees from many different lenses are disadvantaged in the workplace historically. And unless you're going to take action to make things fairer for those employees and level the playing field, um, we won't change society, we won't change the workplace, and um, we won't make pay fair as well, which is what I spend most of my time worrying about is fair pay.
Hmm.
And so for me, taking out advantaging disadvantaged groups to advantaging everybody, which is kind of the premise behind all lives, um, is just doesn't work for me. I'm afraid. So
Hmm. So let's say there's an organization listening to this, or an HR director. What would your advice be? Firstly, let's say that they're looking to introduce a new employee referral program. I'm guessing that you're not against employee referrals, and you're not saying
Nope.
that we shouldn't have them. So if they're looking to introduce an employee referral program, what would your advice be on how they should, uh, how should they start, and how should they implement a good referral scheme?
Yeah. Well, I would say first of all, do some analytics. Well, if first of all, are you concerned about diversity in your organisation? That would probably be my first question. So if you are, then you're going to want to introduce a referral program that has counterbalances in it that help to encourage diversity through that scheme. So if you're not interested in diversity, just introduce a employee referral scheme. It's relatively basic. There's lots of research out there on, I think the CIPD has research, World at Work in the US has research on employee referral schemes and what the typical bonus values are for those. So that's fairly straightforward. If you're interested in progressing diversity in your organization, then you do probably need to look at your general talent pipeline, because you can't just look at diversity for your referrals if you don't know how that compares to diversity for
Mm.
direct candidates that apply in the organization, for example. So you need to do some diversity metrics, and you need to see if you've got a problem. And you also need to then think about whether you want to take some positive action to mitigate that. Otherwise, you just end up with a compounded issue. So, as I said, we've discussed potential tactics. We're seeing employees encourage employees, make awareness to your employee population about encouraging them to recruit diverse candidates, and then look at potentially giving more advantageous referral bonuses if you refer a diverse candidate, which again, as I said, I've seen a few schemes like that in the US happening.
Okay, so a lot of positives, I guess, from employee referrals, but I think what you're saying is that we need to make sure that we, one, look at it from a diversity lens, and make sure that we link it to our other HR processes, and don't just look at referrals in isolation.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Um, okay, so great advice for anyone listening, and I hope we get a lot of good tips from this. But I'm not going to let you go before asking you the question of what is your, and this is now off topic, but I like to ask all the guests this, about what is your favorite film?
Well, that favorite film was an easy one. I saw this in the brief. I think if you'd asked me favorite book, I would have had more of a challenge. But for some reason, I have one favorite film, which is The English Patient, which is from 1996, quite an
Mm.
old film. But it's just stuck with me as one of the most powerful films I've ever seen for many reasons. Epic cinematography, the scenery, heart-wrenching story, and amazing music. And it's really kind of stuck with me for a lot of my life. There are many reasons I connect to it. Anthony Minghella was the director. I think he was an amazing director, and everything I saw of his I really enjoyed. And part of the film is set in Pienza in Tuscany, which is a place that I love to go to. So I've been to some of the scenes where the valley where we stay is where they filmed some of the scenes in the church in The English Patient. It's also the valley where they filmed the final scene in The Gladiator, this
Oh,
place I go
really?
to in Tuscany. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then more recently, I was lucky enough to go to the Royal Albert Hall and do one of their cinema evenings where they have a live orchestra. And I got to see English Patient with a live orchestra, which was just like made me fall in love all over again with the film. So a very easy question for me to answer, Amise.
Oh, great. And I have to admit, I saw it such a long time ago that I don't remember too much of it. So maybe want to rewatch after your yeah,
Recommendation.
great summary as well. And interestingly enough, there's a new Gladiator coming out soon as well, isn't
Hmm.
there? The
Yeah,
so
definitely. Look forward to seeing that. Yeah.
yeah. So out of interest, I know you said that you couldn't pick a book. Are you able to give um, Any tips for HR people that might be looking for a recommendation?
Well, I could say your book on pay transparency.
Thanks.
Case of the
This is
Mondays.
okay. Well, that was definitely not planned. In case somebody's thinking that I'd asked you to say this.
Can I go to my bookshelf because I can't remember. There's another book that I read that I really enjoyed, which is another guy that I know. Let me just get the book. Hold on.
Okay.
I know we've collaborated before on thought leadership. So there's a guy called David Buckmaster who I do thought leadership with, and he actually does a lot of panel moderation for us and for the World at Work. But he was formerly head of reward at Starbucks, and he wrote a book called Fair Pay, and I love it because it, in a similar way to your book, I think it tackles the topic of fair pay, and it's a difficult, deep, sensitive topic, but he does it, the way he writes makes it very easy to read, and it kind of feels personal. So if you're wanting to understand more about fair pay, he particularly breaks down some of the complexities around the analysis of pay equity. So that's a really good book. So Fair Pay by David Buckmaster, as well as your book, Ramiz, obviously. So.
Okay, great. I'm going to add that to my list because I admit it's very difficult to find books on pay and reward, other than ones that are quite academic and it's almost like reading a university book. So
yeah, I haven't read the updated. I remember my CIPD studies in the updated like reward manual, but I know that's just been updated. Again, I'm going to have to look at my bookshelf. Yeah, reward management, which was kind of like when I studied many years ago for my CIPD qualification. But I know Duncan Brown's been involved from who's a great consultant in updating that. And I keep meaning to get a recent copy of that to see if there's how they've updated it to reflect the marketplace today.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Ruth, for all your insights. If somebody wants to connect with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Ruth Thomas on LinkedIn, or ruth.thomas@payscale.com. And yeah, I'd love to connect with any of you and continue the conversation.
Great. And if anybody wants to check out the research that we were discussing today from PayScale, I believe it's from 2018. And
yeah.
Is it available on
I
the
can
website?
share the link to you to download it, but I think I provided you with a PDF, so I don't know if you. But I'll give you the link, and you can include it in the episode notes for the podcast.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Ruth. Thanks everyone for listening, and we will speak to you next time.
You've been listening to A Case of the Mondays. Feel free to share this episode with anyone you think might find it useful. Similarly, if you have any questions about what we've discussed today or would like to suggest a topic for future episodes, get in touch by emailing podcast@3r-strategy.com or head over to 3r-strategy.com to sign up to our mailing list for regular news and updates.